Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. The city was burning under the oppressive heat of summer, and everything moved along in its usual rhythm. Buses rushed down the streets, their passengers lost in their own worlds, heading home. However, the seemingly normal scene hit a deep wound within the society. Every step taken in Montgomery was a product of a system where blacks and whites lived in separate worlds. Segregation had seeped into every aspect of life: homes, workplaces, schools, and even buses. The city's laws forced black people to live, work, socialize, and even sit in specific areas designated for them. One day, Rosa Parks boarded a bus to head home after a long day of work at a textile factory. The exhaustion from the day had tightened her muscles, but the anger and frustration that had built up inside her over the years were even heavier on her spirit. After a long day, she headed to the back of the bus, as that was the designated section for black people. As the bus filled up, she knew they would ask her to move to another seat, but this time, it would be different. Something inside her had changed. As the bus continued its journey through the city, Rosa Parks quietly took her seat. In a world where everyone lived a separate, unfamiliar life, she too took her place, but this time, she was determined to make a stand. Deep inside her, a fire of resistance against injustice began to burn. The beliefs that the outside world had imposed on her that black people didn't deserve equal rights had left deep scars on her soul. Just wanting to take a simple ride home, she sat down, but she was also refusing to accept this toxic system any longer. The bus, slowly moving through the main streets of the city, began to fill up. Soon it became so crowded that only a few seats remained vacant. Nearly all the passengers were white. Suddenly, the bus driver, James Blake, approached Rosa's seat and unexpectedly said, "You need to give up your seat for a white person. Move to another spot." Rosa Parks, looking up at him, felt the spark of rebellion growing inside her. After years of enduring humiliation and battling racism, starting with a single word might be the most effective way to begin. Calmly, but firmly, she said, "No." In that moment, a silence fell over the bus. The driver and passengers couldn't quite comprehend what she had said. This was not just a simple act. It was a moment of standing up for one's humanity, dignity, and equality. In Rosa's eyes, you could see the accumulated anger of years, and the deep helplessness she felt in the face of injustice. She was no longer just a woman trying to take a bus ride. She was a symbol of silent resistance to segregation. The driver, shocked, responded, "Then I'll call the police." Rosa, exhausted to the point where she couldn't fully articulate what she felt, had something ignited within her. The sense of injustice that had been bottled up for years had to be released. Without saying another word, she stayed in her seat. Eventually, the police arrived. Rosa Parks had risen up against the challenges of a system that had humiliated her for years. Now, there was only one thing left to do: let the resistance grow even stronger. Arrested, her silent beginning had ignited a movement that would change the course of history. As Rosa sat on the bus, something shifted within her. The bus slowly made its way through Montgomery streets, and everything appeared as usual. But in that moment, the atmosphere in the bus was different. The silence of the seats just a few steps away symbolized the deep divisions in the city. On one side, there were the black areas, and on the other, the white areas. The lives of both sides were so divided, separated by an invisible wall. Driver James Blake glanced at the crowded bus and noticed Rosa sitting in a section where a white passenger was standing. He thought that Rosa had to give up her seat. This rule, dictated by the system, made whites always a priority. But Rosa Parks's determination didn't yield as Blake had expected. The driver gripped the steering wheel tighter and approached her seat. Slowly but sternly, he said, "This is a section for whites only. I need you to move." Rosa's shoulders stiffened. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm and patient. Her eyes were focused on the bus window, gazing out at the city. As the city rushed by as usual, In her mind, another world existed. Every thought in her mind, every bit of anger, injustice, and the long battle she had fought against oppression came together at that moment. With a single word, she could change everything. But she wasn't going to do that. There was a force within her, quiet, calm, but immensely strong. Years of oppression, segregation, and humiliation. All of it came together in that one decision. Rosa. Parks took a deep breath and, looking directly at the driver, calmly said, "No." It was just one word, but it carried a revolution within it. Saying no was the first major act of rebellion against years of injustice. Saying no wasn't just about refusing to give up her seat on the bus. It was the voice of a people who had silently rebelled for so long. In that moment, a silent cry for resistance echoed through the shoulders of one woman. The driver, confused by her response, looked at her with wide eyes. This unexpected answer seemed to leave him unsure of what to do next. He felt as though the system he had upheld for years, where white people's rights always came first, had been shaken by just one woman's word. Rosa did not get up. She stood, her ground like a mountain, locking eyes with him. The driver's attitude became more rigid. The white passengers on the bus were struggling to understand what was happening, staring at Rosa in silence. The driver clenched his teeth in anger. After a moment of silence, he finally snapped, "Then I'll call the police." He pulled out his cell phone, his frustration mounting. He couldn't accept the situation any longer. To him, this woman's quiet resistance was an error that needed to be corrected immediately. Rosa Parks didn't flinch in response. Her determination grew stronger with each passing second. Some of the other passengers on the bus, unsure of what to do, fell into silence. Many thought what Rosa was doing was brave and dangerous. Many thought such a thing shouldn't be done, but none of them had the courage to speak up. Many white passengers began to feel a mixture of shame and fear as they watched the scene unfold. After a while, the police arrived. They found Rosa sitting in the back seat and approached her slowly. Rosa's heart was racing, but she kept her anger under control and stayed silent. She said nothing. Challenging the law that had been imposed by the driver was one thing, but resisting the police was seen as another crime. Rosa Parks's arrest marked the beginning of a turning point that would change not only her fate, but the fate of all black people in Montgomery. There was a tension in the bus, but that tension also created an opportunity for change. In that moment, Rosa was not just a woman. She was the symbol of the first brave step of a people who had long been suppressed, raising their voices against the rigid rules of the system. When the police forcibly removed her from the bus, a spark of rebellion was ignited in Rosa's heart. She wasn't just rejecting this injustice. She also felt deeply that others should not accept this injustice either. That day, a mark was made in Montgomery's history. With her strength, Rosa not only defended one woman's rights but also laid the foundation for a society's awakening and struggle. In this section, I expanded on Rosa's resistance and the driver's reaction, highlighting the courageous opposition to societal pressures. I made Rosa's inner strength, the reactions of those around her, and the dramatic impact of the event more prominent. Rosa Parks's arrest was not just the unjust detention of a single woman. That moment was the first spark of a fire that would spread throughout Montgomery's streets. Immediately after the incident, the atmosphere in the city began to change. Rosa's unjust arrest marked the beginning of something much larger. Montgomery was like a volcano waiting to erupt. Everyone knew this moment would be a turning point. As soon as the news of her arrest spread, the black community in the city, after years of pent-up frustration, decided they could no longer stay silent. They had had enough. It was time to fight. For black rights, to resist instead of remaining passive. This wasn't just Rosa Parks' struggle. It was the struggle of everyone pursuing justice and equality. That day, the hearts of the black community in the city carried one single purpose: to stand up against this injustice and never back down again. Within hours of Rosa Parks' arrest, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and other civil rights organizations sprang into action. For them, this was a long-awaited opportunity. but also a moment that required great caution. The anger echoing through Montgomery's streets carried with it a huge danger. Just a few steps away, violence. However, the leaders knew this could be the beginning of a revolution. Rosa's arrest exposed the naked truth of the system and highlighted the urgency of the struggle for a people's rights. Organizations quickly began to organize their efforts, to make their voices heard. In that moment, there was only one thing on everyone's mind: boycott. They believed that Rosa Parks' arrest created an opportunity to announce the demand for justice to the whole world. That night, churches in Montgomery came together. They were not just places of worship, but symbols of unity for the community. Within the walls of the church, many activists, including young leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., gathered for an emergency meeting. The subject was clear: the Montgomery bus boycott. The resistance against the bus system wasn't just about halting buses. It aimed to send a message to the entire country. It was time for a people to rise up against years of discrimination for one last stand. The details of the boycott were discussed throughout the night, and finally, a decision was made. The black people of Montgomery would not use the buses. This decision was not just an action. It was a step that would lead to a significant economic weakness for the system. By refusing to use the buses, the black community would shake Montgomery's economic structure. However, the success of the boycott wasn't just about causing economic damage. It was, above all, a fight to reclaim the dignity of this people. Rosa Parks was released on bail, but her release did not bring peace to the city. In fact, the events that followed her arrest began to grow at an unexpected speed. Rosa's name was heard not only in Montgomery but across America. Many people were talking about Rosa's resistance and courage. Some saw her not just as a woman, but as a symbol of the fight for justice. However, when Rosa returned to the city, she walked slowly with a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes. She was now a woman who was writing history by pursuing justice. On the day the boycott began, the black people of Montgomery took a stand by choosing not to use the buses. Everyone preferred to walk to work or shop or to use their private cars. The streets unexpectedly emptied, as this people was making a great challenge to the system's pressure. The bus companies in the city quickly started suffering significant losses. With each passing day, the resistance of the people grew. This wasn't just an economic struggle. It was a war for equal rights. After Rosa's arrest, the people of Montgomery were not just protesting one situation. They were trying to pave the way for freedom and equality for Black Americans. The boycott lasted for 381 days. This was just the beginning. Many African Americans saw this resistance as a turning point in defending their rights. The Montgomery bus boycott became a symbol of a relentless struggle. Most of the buses in the city were now empty because the black people had started raising their voices together, standing up against the system's pressure. And with each passing day, it became clearer that this boycott would grow into a powerful movement that would change all the segregation laws and order in America. Although Rosa Parks had been released on bail, the reaction to her and the people's struggle echoed throughout Montgomery. Her arrest was not just about one person's pursuit of justice. It was a moment that had merged with the freedom struggle of an entire people. And no one could stop this fight now. Rosa Parks' arrest wasn't just the injustice faced by an individual. It was a reflection of the suffering endured by an entire community for years. This incident was the drop that overflowed the patience of the black community in the city. However, in that moment, one woman's quiet defiance served as the spark that ignited the movement for the people to rise up. The streets of Montgomery grew hotter by the hour, and the search for justice became even more apparent. The black community no longer saw this situation as a singular injustice, but believed that this unfairness was part of the system. The Montgomery bus boycott had begun as a concrete result of this belief. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders gathered to start a much larger change in the city. This change wasn't just a reaction to Rosa Parks' arrest. It was a societal uprising against years of inequality, discrimination, and humiliation. Black people were no longer going to bow down. They were going to shout to the world that they were demanding justice. Martin Luther King Jr. took the lead of this movement. His powerful voice helped the resistance gain acceptance and support from the people. It soon became clear that this boycott would reach a scale capable of shaking not only the social structure of one city, but also the understanding of segregation across America. The boycott had a powerful impact from day one. The Black community refused to use the buses. Workers, students, mothers, fathers. Everyone walked or used private vehicles to navigate the streets of Montgomery. Buses quickly began to empty. As the buses continued to run each morning, the number of Black passengers sharply decreased. This was the first major shock for Montgomery's city officials. The bus company started to feel the effects of this sudden loss. While white passengers made up the majority, the bus companies were suffering significant economic damage due to the boycott by Blacks. And this loss wasn't just financial. It was also a sign of the people's resistance against the impositions of a racist system. The Black community had no intention of backing down. This resistance was showing that it wasn't just about Black people. It was a stance against racial inequality throughout all of America. Every day, people were walking to work. Many had to walk several miles to reach their jobs. Although physically challenging, this experience was spiritually empowering. Many people felt great honor in being part of this collective struggle. With every step, they were gaining not only for themselves, but for future generations as well. The streets of Montgomery were becoming increasingly crowded with each passing day, and at the same time, they were becoming more resolute. What initially seemed like a difficult process in the early days of the boycott began to turn into a broader social movement as more and more people joined. This was not just a bus boycott. It was a defense of the social, economic, and political rights of Black people. With every step, a greater force against racism was being born. The boycott didn't only shake the economic power of the Black community, it also began to catch the attention of the white population in Montgomery. White society started questioning the privileges that the system had given them. Many whites were unsure whether to support or oppose the protest. Some were comfortable with the discrimination the system provided, while others struggled to see this inequality and recognize that it was wrong. However, the impact of the boycott had spread to every corner of the city. As days passed, the effects of the boycott continued to grow. The bus company had suffered substantial economic losses. Montgomery was slowly but surely nearing the threshold of change. White officials were unsure of what to do in response to the resistance of the Black community. Another important development in the city was the strong solidarity among the people of Montgomery. Blacks organized themselves to maintain the boycott. Some churches started using their cars and private vehicles as part of the boycott. Others developed alternative routes and transportation solutions for mass transit from workplaces. This determination symbolized change not just in the buses, but in every area of life. The boycott lasted for 381 days. During this period, the voices of not only Black people but of all those seeking equality in America grew louder in the streets of Montgomery. This was no longer just an economic action. It had become a social struggle. Finally, at the end of the boycott, the Montgomery City Court declared bus segregation unconstitutional. This was a victory for the Black people of Montgomery. However, this victory was just the beginning of a wave that would spread across America. The Montgomery bus boycott was not just a people's movement. It was a turning point that opened the eyes of the entire country. Rosa Parks's momentary defiance brought together the people of Montgomery and opened the doors to one of America's greatest social changes. Winning this boycott showed the world how a great change could be sparked with just one step from those fighting for equality. The year 1956 was a turning point that would be written in gold in America's history. The resistance of the Black community in Montgomery was not just a response to injustice in one city. It was an action that opened the eyes of the entire country and took the first steps towards social change. After 381 days of boycott, the great day finally arrived. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation in Alabama was unconstitutional. This was not just a victory for Montgomery. It was the fruit of a resistance against segregation and inequality that spread across all of America. The Montgomery bus boycott had captured the attention of the entire country and had become a source of inspiration for millions of Americans who raised their voices against the injustice and inequality within the system. However, the challenges Black people faced during the 381 days of the boycott were not limited to economic pressures, violence, threats, fines, arrests. Despite all of this, Blacks continued the boycott. With every step, they were aware they were pursuing justice. And in the end, the reward for their determined and unwavering resistance came. The Supreme Court declared bus segregation in Montgomery illegal. This was not just a court decision. It was a victory of the people's years of struggle and resistance. This ruling opened the way for the fight against injustice to inspire millions of Americans who heard and amplified their voices. Martin Luther King Jr. considered this victory as a symbol not only of the struggle of the people of Montgomery, but of the entire nation. He and other civil rights advocates saw this success as an opportunity to take bigger steps in the fight against racism. This decision was a turning point for the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King Jr. continued to take on the leadership of this movement. However, this decision was not only a victory for Montgomery, it was a turning point for all of America. The struggle for the rights of Black people became a wave that affected not just one city, but the entire South and later the whole country. After the segregation on buses was declared illegal, discussions began in many cities, especially Montgomery, regarding discriminatory laws, directing the public's attention to a larger struggle. This case started a process of questioning not just the injustices in one region, but the racist laws across the entire country. Rosa Parks's brave defiance spread like wildfire. She became a symbol on her own. Rosa's name became the symbol of the struggle for justice and equality. Her inner strength had sparked the first spark that ignited the boycott in Montgomery, and witnessing how this spark turned into a giant flame marked the beginning of a global change. Rosa would be remembered not only as a woman, but as a hero, who raised her voice to defend the rights of a people, a nation. The process after Rosa Parks's arrest was not just a struggle against discrimination in one city. It turned the eyes of the entire country to the fight that Black people were waging for equal rights. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders, encouraged by this victory, decided to take even bigger steps. The civil rights movement was no longer just a resistance. It was becoming a struggle for the social, economic, and political rights of Black people. This decision brought a new ray of hope to the whole country. Blacks would continue to pursue justice with unprecedented unity and determination. However, the process following this victory was not going to be easy. In Alabama and other southern states, there was still great resistance behind the victory won by Black people. White society reacted to these changes in the system, and sometimes this reaction manifested itself in violence. However, this could not stop Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders' struggle, because behind this movement, there was not just the desire for equality and freedom from one people, but from all of humanity. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision was a victory in the fight against racism, but there was still much work to be done. However, this victory was the fruit of the people's resistance, and with every step, bigger hopes for the future began to blossom. The declaration of Montgomery's bus segregation as illegal was only the beginning for the civil rights movement. Over time, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and other laws became tangible victories of the struggle of Rosa Parks and others like her. Rosa Parks' name would remain in history books not just as the story of one day, but as the symbol of a people's fight for freedom. This resistance was a revolution that echoed not just on Montgomery's buses, but across all of America and even the world. Rosa, Martin Luther King Jr., and other leaders were the names behind this victory. However, the source of this victory was the courage of ordinary people to enter the battle for justice and equality. That courage gave people the power to fight tirelessly, not just for the rights of one people, but for the rights of all humanity. After her courageous resistance in 1955, Rosa Parks continued her fight for justice and equality throughout her life. After the Montgomery bus boycott, she became not just a symbol but also a leader, a fighter, and a hero who fueled the fire of change. This was not just the heroic story of one woman. It was the quest for rights by millions of people, the freedom struggle of a people, and a giant step in the history of a nation. Rosa knew that her struggle was not limited to Montgomery. She continued fighting against discrimination, violence, and racism in society. For her, this was a beginning. A quiet but powerful step had been taken, and this step would resonate around the world. Rosa Parks' resistance was viewed not as a personal reaction, but as a step taken for societal change. What she did was prove to the world how powerful one person's voice could be, and how an individual could make history simply for standing up for what is right. The contributions Rosa made throughout her life were not limited to the struggle against injustice. She constantly worked for education, social equality, and social justice. After the events of 1955, she became a key figure in the civil rights movement. The difficulties she faced during the boycott and the attacks she endured afterwards strengthened her belief in her struggle. In the early 1960s, she campaigned against racism across the country, alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders. Many people knew Rosa Parks only as the woman who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus. But she was much more than that. She was an advocate for justice, equality, and human rights. In the 1960s, Rosa's struggles evolved into a broader social change movement. What inspired her was contributing to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would lead to significant changes in the following years. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed that year, became a historic law that banned discrimination between blacks and whites in America. Rosa Parks and other civil rights advocates played a major role in the passing of this law. With the law, discrimination in schools, public spaces, and workplaces was officially outlawed. This was not just a victory for America, but for the global struggle for equality and human rights. Rosa Parks became the symbol of this struggle. The resistance she initiated not only defended the rights of her own people, but also showed the world that human rights, equality, and justice are universal values. Rosa Parks' story resonated not only in America, but across the world. Many countries were inspired by her struggle and began taking stronger steps against racism. Particularly, independence movements in Africa viewed Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. as sources of inspiration. Their fight symbolized not just the rights of a community in America, but the freedom struggle of the entire world. Rosa Parks said in an interview in 1965, "My refusal to give up my seat was no accident. At that moment, I simply took a step. That step was going to change the future of millions of people." Rosa, not only with her no, but with the courage she showed throughout her life, left a mark on history. Her struggle was an effort to open the eyes of the entire world. Though she called herself an ordinary woman, her quiet but resolute resistance became a great lesson for the whole world. This was a concrete example of how much a single person could change, and how powerful one individual could be. Rosa Parks spent the last years of her life continuing to fight for justice and equality. She had become a symbol not only for her own people, but for all the oppressed and marginalized people around the world. When she passed away in 2005, she left behind a legacy. This legacy would always serve as a reminder of the need to defend justice, equality, and freedom. Her courage would continue to guide the way. Rosa Parks' life showed what could be accomplished through the resistance of one person. Her struggle didn't just remain in the past, it continues to have an impact today. She wrote her name in history, but the legacy she left behind is not just a story in history books, it's a philosophy and an action that continues to grow every day. Her struggle was not just hers, it was the struggle of the entire world. Rosa Parks taught the world that even one person can change history, how important it is to pursue justice, and how powerful one step, one word can be.